Hello, and welcome to our video about governance, which is based on the principles of Holacracy. We've also recorded a basics and mindset video around self-organization, and if you haven't watched that, then it's probably good to start with that one. So this is one of the more in-depth videos where we're actually going to go into what it exactly is and what does the process look like. So we're stewards of GaiaNet. And our purpose here is to unite, as we call it, unite all the contributors to the new Earth in a regenerative network, facilitating the implementation of a community-type civilization. And our role today with you here is to be a guide for self-organization, to help others distribute authority, distribute power, and get work done in a beautiful way. So, the purpose of that is really to facilitate this construction of a new paradigm on Earth, and we do that through active co-creation support. That's why we're here. And for those interested, you can look on the Auravena website for a definition of the new Earth, which is summarized as a living as a community type society. So, GaiaNet already mentioned about our purpose, and this is one of the many quotes that we got out. It's about co-creating a new Earth that works for everyone. And a very important part of, in general, co-creation, but also a new paradigm that works for everyone is one without the abuse of power. And decision-making in the world, we can look at the political situation and also how this goes in many organizations. You probably have had your fair share of experience of trying to get things done, whether that was in a company or whether that was with a group or a team. And it's challenging. And therefore, we hope to shed some light on what you could use to make better decisions and become more effective at it. We will talk about some basic definitions. We will repeat the difference between governance and operations. And then we will go very deep into the nitty-gritty of governance, which is all about what are roles, what are accountabilities, domains, and policies, and also how do you make adjustments to these things. Then we will deepen and, fully elaborate, actually, the governance meeting process. And then we'll explain also why it's so important that the secretary and facilitator are orchestrating this together and in what way. So we'll deepen that out. And last but not least is, I think this is really the jewel of self-organization. You find it in both sociocracy and in holacracy. And some other forms also have this, but these are the industry-leading movements that use integrative decision-making. And that was, for me, the most amazing part about all of this. Last but not least, before I pass the word on, is like the credits of why we are here today as Daan and Floris, and why GaiaNet is what it is right now, and how we got so good at self-organizing is because of all the help and the support of the people in this box. Holacracy One is the company that created Holacracy and is still developing and innovating it. Energized is a Dutch organization. We got a lot of their content. And then we have had a lot of beautiful people helping us. It was Julia who introduced it to GaiaNet. And Joao, Jonathan, Tom, Christiane, and Joost are pioneers in the self-organization movement that have coached us and guided us. And last but not least, of course, our own playground, our own organization that has evolved for the last 2.5 years to become what it is right now. And I can proudly say that we have no power abuse in our organization. So big thanks to GaiaNet and the personal transformation that it invited all of us to go to.
Yes, awesome. Right. So before we jump in, just a very quick disclaimer, because this is not an official Holacracy class. We have been working with it now for a few years and have been deepening it a lot the past year, let's say. But still, we're not Holacracy coaches, not licensed. And so that means we cannot sell this training or present ourselves as Holacracy coaches. So that's not very explicitly not what we do here. We just try to give you the information that we came across in our journey. We're going to help you present the gems and save you a lot of time in diving into these topics. Or maybe a very quick addition to this. This video is completely copyright free, which means that you still can edit it, spread it in any way, shape, or form that you like. So Today, as Daan said, we're going to talk about governance. And the definition of governance in Holacracy is that governance is the framework of rules, relationships, systems, and processes within and by which authority is exercised and controlled in organizations. So we all already kind of get this in an abstract form often, but with Holacracy, as many other things, it gets super explicit. And it is quite a complex system, and it took me quite a while before I fully grasped the meaning of it. But as Daan said as well, this is truly one of the gems of the self-organization practices. Because making it explicit is something we do in the governance records. Because the governance records are an explicit written set of rules and expectations, including the circles, roles, purposes, accountabilities, domains, and policies of the organization. It can be considered a map of the organization's official authorities, expectations, and restrictions. And this map, this is like a complete map of the organization, everything that's in there, and it's constantly evolving through what we call the governance process. And this is a term to broadly mean the process a circle uses to evolve its governance records. And we do this through, well, really through two processes, either through the governance meeting or what is called asynchronous processes. And we'll go into that a little bit later as well.
So I really like to see this as the playing field, no, of where you are together, and you're like playing a game. And on a football field, you have very clear lines, and you know where's the goal, and there's a referee also. So there's also a facilitator that is governing the process, the football game. And somebody made up this game of the rules of that. And the beautiful thing about Holacracy is that all the players do not only play the game, but they also get to improve the game and to adjust the playing field where they feel fit to it. And that makes a really wonderful, engaging, interactive experience compared to what you see in many traditional organizations with very clearly defined function descriptions and certain managers that hold the power to make changes to this structure, whereas the people who are executing the work usually do not have this authority. And that's very different in self-organization. And that's why it's so liberating for people to participate in this.
Yeah. And it takes some getting used to for people as well, because we're so used to just coming into an organization with a fixed expectation in the role that we fill there. And there's no way you can really change that or influence that. You often don't even know what's in your job description. You know, how often do you actually look at that? While with Holacracy, again, if it's not explicit, it's not real. So that means that everything we can ask from a role is already in the governance records. If it's not in there, you cannot ask that from that role either. So the process, the governance process, is meant to make the implicit explicit. If it's not explicit, it does not exist. And this is so freeing, you know. It started off for me with, like, I first had some resistance to the idea of having written down everything, you know, all these kind of subtle expectations we might have of different roles and stuff. It feels like quite an administrative task. But the beauty is that through this process, because it's all very much through sense tensions and through what's needed in the now for the organization to thrive, you don't have to like design this whole thing and really come up with all the different aspects that are needed. It's about like this continuous evolutionary process of adjusting where work lives and where decisions are being made.
I heard, I was listening to a talk of Brian Robertson, one of the founders of Holacracy, and he was explaining about his company. And he said, if you ask me how this organization structure of this company came to being, I don't really have an answer because I didn't create it. It evolved over time through the partners sensing tensions and energizing roles. And it was really beautiful to hear him talk about this evolutionary dynamic process of going to the next stage of the organizational purpose and its execution. So it's a whole mindset shift, and it's very difficult to grasp if you've never experienced it.
Yeah, and I've realized and noticed it now as well. I also work in a traditional management hierarchy company, and recently, actually, literally like 2 weeks ago, what happened was like I had an expectation from the organization. I was like, here's something that is not covered, I think, or who is responsible for this? I couldn't find out. And then, okay, I just kind of let it go. And through the governance process, we actually have a place to bring that in and to see where that should fit in the organization. And from that moment on, you can actually expect that from that role then. So it's like continuous creation of the structure of the company or the organization. So this is about the hierarchy of purpose. So as we mentioned in the basics and mindset video as well, instead of a hierarchy of people, like in a traditional organization, in Holacracy, we work with a hierarchy of purpose. And that means that purpose is the ultimate boss. That means that like all our decisions are working towards that grander purpose that we have. Now, there are some examples here. So an example of an organization's purpose might be creating a global power shift through self-organization. Now, this is, of course, a big goal. So what you see is that kind of multiple sub-goals or smaller purposes come out of that. And what we do is we create roles. And all these roles have their own purpose and one or more accountabilities. And accountability is really a responsibility somewhere where we can expect work from that role, where the organization can expect work to be done. And we'll go into a little bit deeper about like the exact what an accountability means. But an example is providing one-on-one support to clients practicing self-organization. And now out of that accountability come different projects, right? Because there's work being done there. An example might be a peer-to-peer support network for training participants. And in that project, there are multiple different actions one has to take in order to fulfill or deliver that project. Now, the top part, so everything around purpose, roles, and accountabilities, that is governance. And then below, so everything about projects and actions, that's what we call operations. And there's another video where we dive into operations. So for this specific video and presentation, we're just focusing on the top part of this hierarchy of purpose, being the purpose, roles, accountabilities. And something little extra is domains, and we'll go into that in another slide.
So yeah, it was already mentioned before, but the operations can be defined as working in the organization. And for that, we have operations processes. It's called a tactical meeting. And the purpose of that is to remove obstacles to work for the roles. So certain roles have certain needs, and that's all to take the next steps and deliver the next piece of output towards the organizational purpose. And you can see the governance other described as working on the organization. And that is really working on the structure, the organizational form, the structure, and to define together where does the work lie, which is all tension driven. We'll get to that later. And in traditional settings, these two are melted together. Actually, most people cannot work on the organization. They're mostly doing work in the organization. And what is a key mindset shift within self-organization is that the role is differentiated from the soul. What that means is that we as beings energize roles with an organizational purpose, and we do our best to differentiate the work from the individual's needs. So we are really focusing our awareness and attention on what does the role need and what does the role need as a next step to fulfill its purpose, not what does the human being that's energizing the role need as a next step to fulfill his or her purpose. And also that is a huge mindset shift, but it is a very important element. That it's a very big transformation to learn to separate these two things. And the result is a lot less power play and a lot less emotional interference and disturbances in moving the work forward. Also, this is very liberating, actually. It might seem cold, but it's actually very liberating, and it creates more warmth.
For sure. Yeah, and what I want to add there as well, how how freeing it is also to think about governance when you have a clear differentiation between role and soul. Because in these governance meetings, and we'll go into that, we'll change different roles and accountabilities. And it could very well be that, for example, my role has a proposal on a role that Daan is energizing currently. For example, Daan would be the one responsible for the financial things, and I want to add a responsibility there or an accountability there of around the software for invoices that we use, for example. And maybe Daan doesn't even have expertise in that area, so he's like, no, I don't want that responsibility as a person because I don't have that specific skill set. But that's not what we ask in governance. In governance, what we try to do is create the ideal governance structure for the organization to work towards its purpose. So what we can then do is then Daan can say, okay, so does it fit the role? So not does it fit me, but does it fit the role? And Daan can say, yes, well, actually it does. And then there are other ways, and we'll go into that in another presentation, where Daan can then work through the problem of him not being able to fully express his accountabilities, let's say. There are other parts for that, because this is just about the roles, not about the people filling that.
Yeah, and my personal resistance doesn't interfere in the changes made in the governance. So because I can differentiate it from my role and the soul. And that's beautiful. It dramatically reduces conflict between people in doing work. Another simple example is also we sometimes dissolve roles. And when you are in a traditional organization, if somebody removes you from your function, you freak out, no? Like you think like, where's my work or where's my place? But we are playing a game here of energizing roles. And if we dissolve a role and we can argue for why that is necessary and the role just seems obsolete, nobody feels hurt by it anymore. You don't feel this sense of loss, right? Because it's not like you're losing a part of yourself, but you are just, saying goodbye to a piece of your work. It's just also very liberating.
Right. So we already explained a little bit about what accountabilities are. Of course, you saw a little bit as well about what projects are and actions. So we created a very small exercise here to kind of get a first sense of differentiation between what is an accountability and when it's something a project and when it's something an action. And we'll go deeper into how you can recognize this in further slides as well. So the first example, registering training applicants. That be an accountability or a project or an action. In this case, it's an ongoing expectation we might have of a role, and that's what we call an accountability. So second one, send an email to John with all applicants. Might be a little more obvious, very singular action. So that's what's called an action. And next one is a design standard format for delivering training applicants to John. So this is something that might require multiple steps to complete. It does have a definitive end date where it's actually delivered, and that's what we call a project. Now, next one is negotiating contracts with venues. Would that be an accountability or a project or an action? In this case,
that it's ongoing also. No, it's not a single action, exactly. And yeah.
Exactly.
The last one is booking a hotel. That's also something. It's not booking hotels. It looks like a single action also. Is that a project? No, that's not a project. It must be single action too.
Exactly. Very nice. So a little bit more then about roles and accountabilities and how we can even recognize what these are through the way they are written down. So first, the definition of a role. A role is an organizational entity used to define distinct functions of the organization. The definition of a role includes a purpose to express, accountabilities to consider and to perform, and optionally domains to control. The only way for a role to be created, revised, or destroyed is through the governance process of the circle that contains it. It may be filled by more than one person at the time. So, want to add to roles specifically?
No, I was going to talk something about accountabilities and about the roles. But,
okay. Yeah, let me first define what an accountability is according to the Holacracy definition, at least. So an accountability is an ongoing activity expected of a role, captured as a full sentence that starts with an ing verb, which leads to operational output. So there's an example there as well. So for example, a website manager, so that's the role, might have the accountability for building and maintaining the company's website. So there's that ing word, specifically in English. So it's always about something that's being done on a continuous basis without a clear end date and continuous expectation. And also accountabilities can only be added to roles or circles through the governance process.
so yeah, we see that a role is taking care of a field of work, of multiple activities, ongoing things, and we can also call that where does the attention of that role lives. So what is this role looking after in regards to all of the work that lies in the organization? And the accountabilities need to be very simply understood and always lead to operational output. And so they're like a summary of kind of which things this role is looking for. And the goal is to create small roles and small lists of accountabilities. And the mistake is to make long lists of accountabilities, which just end up in becoming something old again. This is also a practice.
Yeah. Yeah, and what I want to add there as well, that an accountability does not limit a role. So what I mean by that is all these roles have a purpose. And that purpose is like the bigger goal you're working towards. And out of that purpose comes certain accountabilities that we already see and express and made explicit. But as a role filler, you are free to, you are actually working to your purpose. That's what you're doing. So as soon as you sense other work to be done that also works towards your purpose, you can freely do that as well. So it's not just about your accountability. The accountability should be support into fulfilling your purpose as a role. So as Daan already mentioned, it's very important to focus on actual work. So what is the actual work to be done and where does it live? And this is very interesting, especially since we try to avoid managers and traditional hierarchies in Holacracy. It's very important to focus on actual output because there's very often things that are not work here on the side, like managing, monitoring, motivating, leading, words like that, like, monitoring something. What does that mean, or motivating someone? What's the actual output that you're delivering? So, and an important word here is often, it can be that it is work, but make sure you're super explicit and be very careful with power play, because it's very often a way to, check people or tell them what to do or whatever. So yeah, really focus on the output.
So this was for me, this took me a while, to really get this part about accountabilities. And what I recently found helpful as an exercise, because we just did this for our community circle within GaiaNet. We want to start up a new circle with roles and accountabilities. And I just made a big list of all the deliverables, of all the changes, all the output that is being done in the community at the moment, such as posting articles, such as inviting members into the network, such as onboarding them, etc., etc. I made a long list of all the activities. So I made a list of all the actual work that's being done. And then I looked at how can I group this in ongoing activities. And that was very helpful to create roles and summarizing these accountabilities, made it very concrete and easy. And that is very different than what we did at the beginning when we were thinking of the next 6 months, what we thought we were going to accomplish, and then put that into accountabilities. So accountabilities define what the role is doing right now, not what the role is going to do in the future, but what it is doing right now. And that is leading directly to output again. And that makes it easier to see this.
Right. So with the information you just heard, this should be a little easier than the previous one. So again, we have a little exercise here with a few statements. The first one is writing blog posts. That be an accountability project or an action. Now, you could say this is a project because it could be that it's a set of 3 blogs, for example, and there's actually a project. But because the way we've written it down, it's with ing, it's something ongoing, so we know it's an accountability. Next one, a blog post on Holacracy versus sociocracy. Well, that's a project, require more than one action to complete, take some time, and we defined it here, and we'll go through that in the operations presentations more. But with projects, we define it as the deliverable itself. So that's what you have once it's finished. So next one is post the blog on the website. That'd be an accountability project or action. This is an action, like a one-off thing that you do. Now, next one, monitoring blog post visits. So again, with ing, yet this is not a valid accountability, because what are you doing when you're monitoring blog post visits? Are you like looking at your screen all day to see how the graph is going of the visitors on your website? Or, that's not what it's about. So then it's important to zoom in and what is the actual output that we want from this role. In this case, it might be reporting on blog post visits to the marketing circle. And that's then the actual accountability that we're talking about. So Daan already mentioned this a little bit. It's quite important to think about kind of when is something a role and how many accountabilities should it have. And as with everything in Holacracy, the answer is usually just take the easiest route. So there's no fixed way that you need to do this in. It's just about putting accountabilities in useful clusters. Now, what makes sense to put in a role? Just that could be very, very simple if you don't think about it too deeply. And don't be too afraid to make them small and clear. It's okay to have multiple roles. That's also what Daan mentioned. It's actually great if you have a lot of smaller roles, because they become a lot easier as well to transfer to another role filler or another person. Because if you have these huge roles, and that tends to happen in traditional organizations, you have like these people who've worked there for many, many years. They have all the skills and all the expertise, and they're doing all these different things. And then they leave or something happens or whatever. And then, how are you going to replace someone like that? That's practically impossible. Yet, if we zoom into the work that's being done and we realize, well, actually this person was filling 16 different roles. Now, for all these smaller roles, it's a lot easier to find someone who can replace the original role filler than for that huge role. Now, last sentence here, a role is created to suit the needs of the organization. A role is never created for a person. And this is also something that people have to get used to, because in governance, again, with the separation or the distinction between role and soul, we are looking just to the organization as an organism in and of itself, with its own purpose, its own roles, and all we do is we show up in that organization and we energize roles. And the roles should be needed for the organization to work towards its purpose. So it's not about facilitating me and my purpose and my wishes and desires. It's about me showing up in that organization and choosing or deciding on certain roles. So do not make up a role because someone comes in with a specific set of skills if the organization doesn't need that.
And we noticed this is hard. For us, it was hard in the beginning because we didn't really get it. Even though reading for a year, we would still make roles with lots of accountabilities. So it takes practice, to simplify it, I guess. And because I guess we're so programmed to, wear many hats and not really clearly make explicit what it is that we do for a variety of reasons. And it makes it easier also to work for multiple organizations once there are much more smaller roles, and you can take on a little bit here, let go a little bit there. So that becomes really fun over the long term when you're in an ecosystem of multiple organizations. And finally, this part about, this took me a while to integrate this, that a role is not created for a person, because that's what we did in the beginning. We thought, like, what do we enjoy doing? What are we good at? And then let's create some roles, and then let's practice holacracy. No, that's not the way to go. The way to go is to, if you're already running as an organization, to properly identify which work there is and segment that in roles, and then just let tensions arise and let it be tension driven. But we'll get to that also later in this presentation.
Right. So this is probably the biggest difference between an organization working with holacracy and a more traditional organization. That is that in traditional organizations, any action is forbidden unless explicitly permitted by legitimate authority. Right? You feel very confined, and you only really do something when your boss tells you to or allows you to do something. While in holacracy, any action is permissible unless explicitly forbidden by a legitimate authority. So that means everyone is free to just go. And there are nothing stopping you apart from the rules that you set together or that are part of the Constitution.
And I think this part is deeply explained in the operations more, about individual actions and moving forward. We're not going to go too deep in this talk, but it's a very important part, this being permissible.
Yes, definitely. Yeah. And this one is more valid because those rules or policies, as we call them, are part of the governance process. And anything is permitted as long as you do not break any explicit rule as described in a domain policy or the Constitution. Now, what happens with organizations that are new with holacracy is they tend to very quickly add domains and add policies, and just again kind of creating this very forced and locked up structure, while the idea is, and the strategy around rules is to have as few as possible and as many as needed, right? So of course there have to be rules. There are going to be rules, especially if you don't have a manager or a boss who can tell everyone what to do. And it is important to set that boundary, but you still want to create as much freedom as possible for all the roles to express themselves fully and work towards their purpose. And the more freedom everyone has, the more magic that will happen, and the faster, of course, this whole organization grows towards its purpose. Do you want to talk a little bit about domains, Daan?
Yeah, you touched upon it a little bit. How it's defined in the Constitution is that it's something exclusively controlled by a specific role or circle, i.e., no one else may impact the domain without permission from the domain holder. You can think of something as a social media role that might own the company's Twitter account. A domain is functionally the so-called property of a role or circle. So they're like assets, digital spaces, but can also be a company car, anything that a role or a circle would like to have control over. And then we have policies that you install, and they kind of unlock access to that domain. So they can either grant a specific access or limit a certain access. And it's defined as a rule that grants or constrains authority, such as allowing or limiting others from impacting a domain. For example, if a social media role owns the domain of a corporate Twitter account, a policy might be enacted to allow an event promotion role to make posts to Twitter. For example, the event's promotion has permission to post events-related content to the corporate Twitter account. For example, we have that on our website. We have the website, and Floris is the website manager. He's not the manager, but he is the owner of that domain. He installed the domain, and he said anybody can change the text on the website. But if you want to make changes to the structures, the links, and the different headers, then you need to just contact me first or I will do that for you. Because we were having challenges around that people were moving things around and it didn't work well together anymore. And Floris felt into what is the minimum amount of restriction that I need to install to avoid this problem while still having all these roles open to change the website. And I can tell you, boy, it's so liberating, because now that I see things in the website, I don't need to approach a role anymore. I would just change a piece of text. And actually, I see our website evolving over time. Sometimes I log in, it's like, oh, somebody's been working on the website, and it's not been Floris, because Floris has been taking care of the structure, but other roles are working on it. It's really beautiful.
Yeah, and also, again, such an exercise of giving people that freedom, because like we are so used to these structures that it's also easy to kind of slip in that mindset of limiting everyone, right? Of already setting all these rules, because with the website, for example, there are many reasons we might come up with to think that nobody should touch it, right? Maybe they don't have the tone of voice right, or maybe they make errors in the text, or maybe it's ugly because they don't do the design right. And then, like all these reasons could be true, but they never happened. So instead of thinking of all these things that could go wrong, we wait till something goes wrong. In this case, it was about the structure and the links, because then, other parts of the platform didn't work anymore that were referring to that. So something actually breaks. Now, that's the best time to actually introduce a policy then, instead of forcing that up on people beforehand.
So I already mentioned a little bit how domains work. It limits others by centralizing control to a certain area of the organization. And an example could be that do not use your neighbor's car. So in other words, it's like there's a domain and then there's a policy, you cannot use that. A domain owner holds full autocratic control over the domain. That means that the domain owner can do whatever they want with that domain, pretty much, and can then allow the access or the limit to that domain through the governance process, but is the one who is suggesting these changes to the domain. And I already mentioned it could be like a website, right? Like our website control, or it could be a piece of software, could be an office alarm system, but it could also be a certain process. For example, Alexander is holding the recruiter role right now, and his domain is the recruitment onboarding process. He's designed a process from first phone call, first contact, and people say, hey, I want to work with GuyNet, work for GuyNet. And then the whole step-by-step process is something that he's overseeing. And he decided to make that a domain that he is the only one overseeing how people move through that. And finally, a role cannot exercise control over another domain unless you get permission from the role or through a policy. So that's kind of that example that I gave, like the website and the structure of the linking that Floris has as a domain. We can still change or access that, but we need to contact him first or follow what's written in a policy. You can also define how the access can be done in the policy. For example, you can use your neighbor's car, but you bring it back with a full tank of gas and it's got to be cleaned. Something like that. That can be the policy of using something. And I also already went a bit in how these policies then work. So it's a rule that grants or constrains authority to a role, as I just mentioned. But it is very important that you cannot force work with the policy. So a policy cannot demand action. They can only limit or allow certain action. And this allowing action is not forcing action. So you cannot say anybody wanting to use the website has to do this or that. We cannot force anybody to do any work. We can only protect a certain area with some kind of constraint. And again, you want to limit it as much as possible. The introduction of policies, domains, and structures as least as necessary, as much as needed, but the least possible. And finally, if a domain is already under the control of your role, you do not need to go through the governance process before setting policies. So the domain goes through the governance process, but introducing policies is something you can just add to your domain. And you can choose to, well, we use a tool called Nestor where we hold these records, and then you can just add them there, or you can inform your circle members that you've introduced a new policy, but it doesn't go through the governance process. And last, a little example. Well, I already gave some examples, but this one is about the website also, that every role can change the text on the website. But for example, they cannot add or remove any pages or change any URL without consent from the role website admin, as I just explained this example of Floris holding this role.
Right. So, as we already mentioned quite a lot in the basics and mindset presentation, of course, is that tensions are really at the core of what we are working with here. Tensions are really a creative force. Tension is really the difference between the situation now and where we feel it could be. And like the farther that is apart, the bigger the tension is. And so what we try to do in the different meetings is we try to resolve these tensions to just keep working closer towards that purpose. Now, the reason we mention that here as well is because tensions are not just important in the tactical meetings for the operations, but also very important in the governance meetings. Because, as we already touched upon, we can have this top-down design of what the ultimate structure of our organization should be. But that's really, it doesn't work, and it's way too slow. Because what we want to do is we want to change the governance structure based on what we are feeling and sensing and in the now, in the here and now. So how should a specific circle work within itself? We don't have to kind of have like this top management layer, think of the structures and all the stuff. We want that everyone who's actually working in the organization is a sensor, can actually feel the tensions, feel where the gaps might be in the governance structure. And add to that, through a very specific process that we'll go into. You want to add something on tensions?
Yeah, well, I think for us, and also when we are guiding people through this process, that this takes a little bit of time. I think it takes like half a year of moving forward with self-organization before you're starting to grasp how this really works, because also this is such a mindset shift. But once you get it, though, and you see the simplicity of it, and you come back to governance on a regular basis, then it's super liberating to clean things up and to feel like, where are we now and what is needed next? And well, usually these tensions arise in a tactical meeting. Most of governance changes and modifications arise because somebody has an obstacle in his or her work. It could be that you feel we are not sending out a newsletter yet, and it seems important, and you feel that we should do that on a regular basis for our organization. So that's a tension that arises in a tactical meeting. And then the secretary makes a note, okay, let's process this in governance. And let's see where this work lies. And let's make a change to our records, either add an accountability or start a new role. Or if I don't know, a new opportunity arises and you open a new field or a new client, or there's just new needs, that the organization needs to serve. Needs surface all the time as we are evolving an organization. And these evolving needs arise as tensions and then lead to changes in the organizational structure. That is a whole different approach than what we are normally used to when we set this big goal for in 3 years or 5 years, and we look at the market and all the analysis, and then we think of what are the needs, the organizational needs, and then design an organizational structure, and then go run that organizational structure, which usually doesn't work as well as this evolving, adapting form of continuously modifying according to the needs of the organization. So changes in the governance, it's very important, is purely tension driven.
Yeah. And this is so beautiful. It's also like, this is how nature solves for complexity, right? Like, this is why a forest doesn't have a CEO telling every tree where to stand. It's an evolutionary process, and it just happens in the ground. And then there's self-organization on all these different levels. And that's how you get that perfect fit with the environment, with the actual outside world. That does change all the time, like needs come in, needs fall off, and it just,
And that's why nature is resilient. And that's why likely many organizations, because the world is changing so fast nowadays, I personally imagine in 10 or 20 years, you're not going to make it anymore with the old way of approaching life, because the technology is ramping up, the challenges are ramping, everything is going in this hockey stick curve. So the changes are increasing, the speed of change. So we need to be able to adapt faster. And this is a tool that works for that, for fast changing environments.
Yes, right. So the governance process is really meant for only a few things. It is to create, remove, or modify the roles of a circle. It's about creating, removing, or modifying the domains and policies of a circle. And lastly, it's about electing people to the constitutional roles of the circle, which are only a few. So, and here again, to kind of repeat this, we're going to talk about governance meetings now. So this is the actual meeting in which the governance records are being adjusted. And there are only, as I said on the last slide as well, only a few specific things that can be an outcome out of a governance meeting. So changes in purpose of that circle, changes in the role and accountabilities, domains and policies. And that also means that what's not brought up in a governance meeting is anything on projects, anything about actions. So that's about operations, and we have a different container for that called the tactical meeting, which we'll also talk about in the operations video. We are not talking about allocating resources in any form. And this is an interesting one because this sometimes sneaks in. Because, you know, as Daan mentioned, with like he has an example of the newsletter role, right? So he feels like we need to send out the newsletter, and he brings that in governance. And then somebody might say, okay, well, we don't have anyone available for that. You know, we don't have any time to allocate towards that specific accountability or role. And that's not what we talk about in governance. All we do is create that ideal structure in the now. And then we have other ways of fixing allocation of resources and stuff. So it also means that there's we don't talk about anything that refers to a person. So we don't assign roles. That's there's another process for that. And only thing we do is elections. That's the only thing that's about people in this context. So there are a few chosen roles: the facilitator, the circle rep, and the secretary. And they are elected as people, but that's the only thing around people in governance meetings. The rest is just about the roles, accountabilities, etc.
And the reason there are elections for this, which are recurring, these elections can happen every 3 or 6 months, but these are power holding roles. And be careful with how you interpret these words, because they don't hold any power over anybody, but they hold a certain centralization of authority, which could lead to power play if people are not fully transformed or engaged in this kind of a mindset. And therefore you want to elect people to that. So we choose as the people who is going to represent this kind of authority. And also they're quite frequently recurring to test and see if everybody's still happy with these people holding this kind of authority. And for example, the circle lead role is the one that has autocratic authority to assign people to roles. So that doesn't happen in governance, but it happens by this one particular role. And you think like, wow, that person can have a lot of power. But there is another little disclaimer there. If you're the circle lead role, you also have to carry all the unfulfilled accountabilities in the organization. And there are some other things with this circle lead role that it sounds like it's a manager role, but it's always done on invitation and always voluntary. So yeah, again, there is no possibility for power play, but therefore we have these elections of certain specific roles in the governance process. That's the only exception around people.
Yeah, and we'll go into those specific roles in another presentation as well. But to also add to that a little bit, like it's not that a manager in a traditional organization has no function at all, right? There's a lot of nonsense going on there, but there are some specific things that actually need to happen, right? So we don't have to throw out the baby with the bathwater. All we have to do is make a structure in which that cannot be abused. And that's also why these roles are split up and there's multiple roles all carrying a part of that authority. So 2 of these are the facilitator and the secretary. And it's important to zoom in a little bit about these 2 roles because they have a very important role to play in the governance meeting. The facilitator, that's the one who's honoring and guiding the process of the meeting itself. And it's up to the facilitator to explain the process as well during dedicated timeouts. So it could be that somebody doesn't understand the process of the governance meeting, and they can do a little timeout, and then the facilitator will explain the process. And it's up to the facilitator to stay really neutral, yet making sure that the focus is on solving the tension of the proposer. So we'll go into what this actually looks like in practice in this presentation later on. But it's very important for the facilitator to really relax into the process that's been set by the Constitution. It's just a fixed structure in Holacracy that we'll go through. And he or she can fully rely on what we call integrative decision making. That's the process we go through to work through all these proposals. So this is really the person who's guiding the meeting itself, or the role that's guiding the meeting itself. Now then we have the secretary, and the secretary has a very important role to play as well in governance meetings. One, it's about sharing parts of the governance records upon request, right? So it could be that there's a proposal for a certain accountability and somebody asks, for example, hey, I thought this was already covered on the role X, Y, or Z. And then it's up to the secretary to grab the records and, verify if this is already part of that role or not. So the second part is about getting the proposal as clear as possible. So the secretary really works with the facilitator and with the proposer to really, capture in words what the role is actually trying to achieve there. And another important part, and that's also why there's a power or an authority part there, is about interpreting the Constitution upon request. So the Constitution is the basic set of rules underlying Holacracy, and it could be that there's some unclarity on the interpretation of it, and then it's up to the secretary to make a call on that, how to interpret that specific part. The secretary will also finalize the proposal. So if there's any changes being made on the proposal, the secretary will capture those into the final proposal. And it's also responsible to adding the accepted proposal to the governance records itself. And if you are using software specialized for this is all done automatically, the adding at least.
So in a good dance, when you have a good secretary, it's really a joy as a facilitator, since you can be fully present. And if you've practiced the governance process, then it's really just reminding people of that process. And the process will do the work. And the people will form the proposal, and the reactions and all of these things all help the proposer forward, but it's the proposer who is doing the work. And the secretary is really, should also have a relatively easy job if there's a good facilitator. And it's also actually quite enjoyable to go through that process, to have the authority to listen well, to summarize it, to write it out for the people, and then in the end, once it's approved, to put it in the records. That sounds really dry, but it's actually really enjoyable. And when you are really dancing together as facilitator and secretary, then the whole group can relax and they can just be present and feeling also what are their needs and why again did we bring this to governance and what is it going to lead to and how can we make sure that it's very clear. And yeah, then altogether you start to play a big symphony. So these 2 roles are really like orchestrators of the governance process.
So every governance meeting really looks the same. It has a very clear structure. We always start with a little check-in round, which is basically an internal weather report where everyone just shares their current state of mind, any distraction that might be alive. And we just let somebody talk and there's no responses or discussion or whatever. It's just about having everyone be heard and setting the stage for the meeting that is to come. Now, next is the biggest chunk. First, we start building the agenda with tensions to process, and then one at a time, we process each agenda item through integrative decision making. And lastly, we have a little checkout or closing round where each participants share a close reflection on the meeting, also without responses or any discussion.
Yeah, and this middle part where we work on the proposals is really based on creating a really good proposal. So that's the first half of getting through a proposal, and the other one is really working on the objections. So these are the main two parts of this processing of tensions. It's about helping the proposal, but not doing it for the proposal, but everything is to assist the proposal to create a really good proposal that would solve the tension that drove this proposal to arrive. So it can be a new role or new accountability or a domain. And the reason why this came up needs to be very explicit and very clear for all participants involved, that they understand why this is installed now. And then the second part is really the safety check, that no harm is done to the organization and or no harm is done to any of the other roles in the organization. So these are really the two big building blocks, and these find each other halfway through integrative decision making. And that, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Because to emphasize that, really the point is not to arrive to consensus around any proposal. That's really important. So all we try to do is we try to help the person bringing in the tension to resolve that through the proposal. And we have to make sure it doesn't cause any serious harm or damage to the organization. And there's a set of questions that we ask to test if an objection is valid. And we'll go through that later in this presentation as well. So maybe you can take us a little bit through integrative decision making.
Yeah, for me, heaven. I've sat in many circles in my life, and I've been at universities, work environments, and gosh, making decisions with other people, you know. I've always found it very challenging. I found it very hard, and because there was no structure for it, and there was no process for it. And we were often seeking consensus in all these environments, because there is just nothing explicitly made about who holds any kind of authority. Or you end up being with the boss and a team, and the boss holds the final call. Now, you still make a lot of decisions together, but I have found that in the past, my discussions with people and decision-making have been very lengthy. Took a long time, like a really long time. And often you process one or two agenda items in 90 minutes. And this kind of integrative decision-making for making changes to the structure, which affects everybody. It's very important to be aware of that you are all together, working together on a structure that affects everybody. And the beautiful thing about that is that every voice is heard, that nothing is overlooked, right? For example, if you have majority voting, that there can be one or two people that have a really serious, it's not even an objection, it's a gift, you know? It's like, hey, we're overlooking this. If we do this, that's going to break down, or we're going to get damaged, or the organization is in danger. And that's overlooked at majority voting. With consensus decision-making, consensus means everybody agrees, means not there is no objection, but it means everybody thinks this is a good idea. Oosh. Oh my God, the amount of time people take to explain themselves and give their perspective. And look, it's beautiful, okay? It's beautiful to be in a circle like that, maybe with your family at home, to hear everybody out. But when you want to move an organization forward, not everybody needs to agree with everything, because it takes a tremendous amount of time. But what you want to do at all times is you want to avoid serious harm. You want to, I think that's what everybody wants all the time, actually. Why people are so elaborate, because they all want the best for everybody and for the organization. Well, this integrative decision-making is a very simple step-by-step process that has really good checks inside that we'll go over, that pretty much eliminates. It's super efficient. It's super effective. Everybody feels like they're engaged, and everybody feels heard and seen. So nobody feels left out. So check, you know, the connection, the voices are heard, and everybody's objections are heard. And most of the time, they're also integrated even. So the proposal gets changed. So that also creates this connection that you really feel that, okay, we're in this together. And that's beautiful. So it's fast, it's efficient, it's connective, it's warm, and yeah, it really works. So what does this process look like? It's quite simple actually, huh? The main thing is there was a tension by somebody, by a role sensed, that led to an agenda item, and then that led to a proposal by that role. So there is somebody presenting this. This is the proposer, and that person is in the middle of the circle and explains to everybody in the most detail that is available what is the proposal to solve this tension. The next round is an open round of clarifying questions. So there's no order in that. It's random. And anybody who didn't understand, who didn't intellectually comprehend the proposal, so this is very important, right? It's about the text, what has been explained, if they understand that. And they can ask clarifying questions. So we're now going to explain to you in detail what this governance meeting process looks like. And it's about presenting a proposal, answering clarifying questions. Then there's some reactions from everybody. The proposer gets an option to clarify. And that's when after that, we raise objections and integrate those. And then finally, the proposal is accepted. So let's have a look at what this looks like in detail. The first thing is the proposal comes from a tension. As we said before, that this is all tension driven. So there was something sensed, some obstacle in the work or some organizational need, and that led to a tension, which was brought to governance. Now, then there's one individual that is the lead of bringing in this proposal. So you can prepare this as much as possible, and it can be modified a little bit in there. So the facilitator may allow others to help craft the proposal, but the facilitator must really focus on this help solely to get an initial proposal to address the initial tension. And that's pretty much already good enough.
Yeah, I would maybe even not recommend this for organizations that are fairly new with Holacracy, or at least facilitators that are fairly new, because it can be quite complex to keep it from becoming a full-on discussion. You know, and it's always so important also for people to feel the ownership, that if they feel the tension, if their role feels the tension, to take ownership, create a proposal themselves, and, you know, make sure that it's just good enough to resolve the tension, instead of, again, creating this perfect, complex proposal with every, you know, that's just not needed, as long as it just resolves the tension of the proposer.
And it's empowering, because this is what you mentioned earlier in this talk, that you felt something for your current company that was useful, and kind of like it ended up in the box. But if you would have been in a holacratic environment, you would have brought in this tension, and it leads to the evolution of the organization. So the next step is, once the proposal is explained by the proposal, for people to have an open round of clarifying questions. And this is really only to better understand either the proposal or the tension that drove it. The proposer may choose to answer these questions, but doesn't have to. So you can also say, no comments or no information or whatever. But it is very important that the people only ask questions to understand, so to intellectually grasp what was just explained. Why did this arise, and how can this be moved forward? Not about all the consequences or effects or all the other things. So yeah, the facilitator will be very strict in this process, because it's hard for people to understand what is a clarifying question. And often a lot of deepening questions arise in this round, we found. And they will be stopped by the facilitator, because they're all welcome and they're very important. So all of this will be heard, but this comes in the next round. And finally, any participant can ask the secretary to read the proposal, or ask for any other existing governance records. Could also be that you think like there's an overlap with a role, or it looks like double with something, and then can you please look up that role and read it out to me?
Yeah, what I want to emphasize here is that a clarifying question is not a sentence with a question mark at the end, but it's really about clarifying what it says. And this is actually quite tricky, you know, and I still sometimes doubt if my question is really a clarifying question, or what I'm doing is secretly kind of pushing my own opinion in there, you know, because wouldn't it be better to do X, Y, Z? It's not a clarifying question, you know.
I am also still falling for that trap. So it takes practice, but every time you do it, you get better. So finally, this round, after we all understand the proposal, is really to share broadly what happened for me when I hear all this, when I hear the tension and when I hear the proposal. So one person at a time, no discussions, and it's really important that there's no discussion here. So you put on a random order or something, you go one by one, and you explain, what do I feel about this proposal? What do I think about this proposal? And any kind of reaction is valid, but it's very important that it's directed at the space and directed at the proposal, not at the person, not at the individual, or a bunch of other tensions that are alive for you that may be affected by this. So also here we try to container it and help as much as possible to engage with this proposal. And also here the facilitator will be very strict to the out-of-turn comments, to any engagement with others in the circle and the dialogue, or like I said, any reactions other than that of the proposal. The proposer can choose to clarify and amend, but doesn't have to do so. So it's free for the proposal to listen to everybody, make notes as all these reactions are done. And often a lot of gold is shared, like, oh, this is a great amendment, a great adjustment. Or maybe it's very clear for the proposer, but notices that it isn't for some other. So it might choose to explain and elaborate a little bit. But the purpose for this of options to clarify and amend is really only to address the tension of the proposer. Not any of the tensions that was heard, that any others shared, that it could affect their roles or other things, okay? And finally, also here the facilitator will be very strict to stop comments by anybody else than the proposer or the secretary at that stage. And the secretary here is to listen really good to everything that's being said by the proposer and make any adjustments or modifications to the proposal. And then once that's all been integrated, then we do an objection round. That's really the final step to check if there's any harm, right? And each participant may raise concerns, don't have to do so. They can also, well, everybody's asked to participate, and that's very important. We usually ask the people, like, really take some time. Do you feel that this could cause any harm to the organization or to your role? So it's a very important part. People are a little reserved, right? We want to, feel nice with each other, but these objections are very valid to, best evolve the organization forward. So the facilitator listens attentively and must capture these objections and then test them. And we'll show you later how that works. If there's no objections, then the proposal is accepted. Finally, also for the facilitator here, while testing the concerns and capturing objections, the facilitator again must stop or disallow discussions or responses of any form or anybody else than the objector. Again, we try to listen to one person, we try to really capture that, and we work with that step by step, part by part.
So maybe I can jump in a little bit about how we test these objections. Because as Daan says, it's very important to surface any objections, because we want to make sure that there's no harm being done to the organization or towards working to the purpose. But we also want to give all these roles the freedom to just, explore and just go. So there's a set of criteria that an objection has to. So the objection has to be, the criteria have to be met that are there for an objection before we actually have to integrate that objection into the proposal. So the facilitator will test any objection by actually asking a fixed set of questions that look like this. So of these 5 criteria, the first one is the proposal would hurt the circle's capacity to express its purpose or accountabilities. And the question we ask to test that is your concern a reason that the proposal causes harm, or is your concern that the proposal is unneeded or incomplete? Because this happens very often. Maybe you see harm because you feel like it's not fully captured what that role is supposed to do, for example. Well, then, it's unneeded or incomplete, that's not a valid objection. So it's out. Now, again, an objection has to go through all these criteria, and all have to be yes before you can before you actually integrate the objection. So the second criterion is the proposal would limit the purpose or accountabilities of the objector's role. And we test that by asking, would the proposal limit one of your roles, or are you trying to help another role or the circle in general? Also a super interesting question, because if it's not your role that's being impacted by that actual harm, then the other role, the person that is actually impacted, the role that is actually impacted by the harm, would have brought in an objection if it's valid. So if you're just trying to help somebody else out, it's again about projecting something. It's not about what's actually affecting your role, so it's not valid.
And here it's very important to have the proper differentiation of your role and your soul also, because we can feel it would limit me as an individual, but that is also definitely not a valid objection. So we're looking at the roles and accountabilities and the purpose of the organization.
Yes. Right. The next one, the proposal would introduce a new tension for the objector if adopted. So the question that we ask here is the harm created by this proposal, or is this already a concern even if the proposal were dropped? So it could very well be that you already feel a certain tension, then a proposal that's kind of about that comes up, and you have an objection because you have felt this tension, blah, blah, blah. But if it already was a concern of you, so it was already an existing tension, then it's not caused by this proposal. So it's not a valid objection against this proposal. And then there are other spaces where we can bring in that tension, of course. So then the next one, with the criterion, the objections either based on presently known data or is necessarily predictive because the circle can't adapt later. So this is about, well, the question we ask here is, would the proposal necessarily cause the impact that you see, the harm, or are you anticipating that this impact will occur? Also quite an interesting one, because that it does.
That happens a lot. But in the future, or this, or what if that person gets sick, or all these things in the future, they're not here and now.
Yeah. And so you're really asked here to bring data, you know. If you know this is actually causing harm, then of course it needs to be integrated. But if you're just predicting, or, you know, then yeah, there's no data there. So we'll see. It's not a valid objection. So it could still be, by the way, that you are anticipating it. But it could be, like, for example, you're just sure that if something happens, you know, it's just high legal risk, for example. So, you know, you never went through that problem as an organization, but you know, there's actual harm there. No, it doesn't always exclude it. So there's a second question there, which is, could significant harm happen before we can adopt, or is it safe enough to try, knowing we can revisit at any time? And this resolves a lot of tension. Because, you know, in many organizations that work with Holacracy, you have a governance meeting, for example, every 2 weeks. So that means if you now see that there might be harm caused, but you know that in 2 weeks you can change it again, you know, is it safe enough to try? Yes or no? And then often it is safe enough to try for that limited period of time. And then often you actually realize that the harm that you were projecting doesn't happen at all. Because people are still, you know, they still think when they work, you know, they know what they're doing. They usually act in good faith. So you can often trust people more than many people do. And then lastly, it could be that there is a valid objection there, and then we have to integrate that. And that means that we're going to amend the proposal that in a way that it would not cause the objection, but that it would still address the proposer's tension. Because that's what we're working on, right? We're trying to resolve the tension of the proposer. Now there's an objection there. So we work out with the objector and the proposer, the facilitator will work out the amended proposal that both are happy about. And then you will go back to the objection round, test one more time if anyone still has objections. And if not, then the proposal is accepted. Woo.
Yeah, and some of you might look at all of this and be like, wow, but almost no objections are valid. And that is actually the case, that many objections are figments of our imagination and our own fears and insecurities or other things. And you can, well, you know how this works. You're alive and you're on this planet and you've tried to create things with other people in a variety of settings. You know how hard it is to make decisions with other people and how often people object or have reservedness around a certain move together. And that's okay, and that's normal. The beautiful part about this integrative decision-making process is that it really reduces harm. It really works to safeguard the mission and the people inside of it and make sure that nobody's limited and blocked in their work. So even just applying this governance process in your current organization, in your family system, with your partner, you could technically apply it for any kind of format. And specifically for an organization that is changing fast in our current time and age, this is a really wonderful, wonderful tool to move things forward. And I've never experienced this in my life. I'm forever grateful. And well, this combined with the operations process, which is another video, and the basics of self-organization, pretty much give you a really good start of applying this in your life, for your work, for your life. And the final note, I think, before I pass it on to some last words of Floris, is don't try this at home alone. It's like if you want to learn to play an instrument, sure, you can watch some YouTube videos, you can start practicing. But if you want to get good at this and you want to really, start getting to beginner's level, then you really need a teacher and you need a guide and you need some expert of some person who has done this before you. So go and try and find somebody with self-organization expertise if you want to adopt this.
Yeah, definitely true, especially with this governance process, because, we are already used to operations. We're used to getting work done, even though that can be much more effective. I will go through that in the other presentation. But we are not used to thinking about the governance structure and having roles that explicit. While for me, this is the absolute core of what Holacracy is about. Like if you grasp this process, this mindset, and it's deeper than just following the steps. There's a switch there, and as soon as that kind of clicks, then all the other things become a lot easier and a lot more clear. So it really all follows from that governance structure. And it does help, to have a facilitator there who is experienced, because we have, well, it really, I think it took me 2 years before I fully grasped what this is. And I'm still deepening, right? I'm still not there. It just keeps spiraling deeper in there. But especially this part, it's really a core piece.
We got really better when we got experts on board. And the first 1.5 years that we've been working with this, we did it from blogs, websites, and whatever. And I wish we had this realization earlier. Because once we started to get this, like our governance meetings now are so easy and so fluid and so fast. And we finish everything. But before we had big lists of governance items that we just couldn't digest. And I had resistance also going to our meetings because I just didn't get it properly. But with a good proposal and some good reactions, then it becomes really easy. But you really need a good guide. And like you say, it's much more difficult. And it's mainly because people are getting authority to change the structure that they are working in. And that's very unusual. Don't have that in your usual working environments. Yeah.
And one last thing I realized that we didn't mention is like, the better everyone in the circle gets at this, the better everyone is aware about Holacracy and knows how this works, the less governance meetings you're going to need. Because there's also something called asynchronous processes, where you have a proposal and you just ask for objections. And if people are trained enough in Holacracy, they can just very quickly see, oh, no objection. And boom, it gets done in the governance records and you can move through. So it might seem like a long process, what we just went through, and it is. But it is meant because we are going through the more complex proposals through that, and the easy ones we can often do through asynchronous processes.
Yeah. It might seem long, but it's actually simple. There's a tension that arises. There's somebody that proposes a change in the structure. You go through a process to make this change in the structure, and the tension is resolved and the work can move forward. It's a really simple process, but internally it has like 6 steps that you need to go through. But like you say, once you've mastered these 6 steps, this can be a matter of 5 minutes or 10 minutes to make adjustments in the organizational structure that works for everyone. It's incredible. Yeah.
Awesome. Yes. So I think that's it. Thanks everyone for listening and viewing, and we hope to see you at the other videos as well, or in any of the live spaces.
Yeah, thanks for watching. It's been a joy to record these, and I hope also this will help many people to make more beautiful decisions and to realize these projects towards a new paradigm, towards a new earth.
Awesome.
Aho.
Cheers.